Okay, so this webinar is being recorded. And with that, I'll turn it over to Calvin.
Yeah, thank you, Vincent, and thanks, Justin. Yeah, this is a great topic. I presented this back almost 10 years ago, but it really hasn't changed too much. We still have our world of bidding and trying to acquire work is still very prominent on people's minds. One of the things I have to say is kind of an introduction to the topic is it all depends on probabilities, and that kind of scares people a little bit. It scared people back in the 15 and 1600s too, when Cardano, Galileo, and Pascal assumed that the probabilities relevant to problems they tackled were known. And just as a little bit of a backstory, the Rand Company in the early 60s were trying to figure out whether their calculators were working properly. So they had to really dive into random number generation. And doing that, they had to understand the probabilities of producing numbers that were truly unique. And they realized that there's some past history that they could go from to find out how these probabilities worked. They went back to some research from 1873 by an Englishman named Joseph Jagger. Jagger was an engineer and a mechanic in a cotton factory in England, but he had an intuitive feel for probabilities and their shortcomings in his machinery. So he turned his intuition into wondering whether Monte Carlo theory was really true, meaning the random generation of numbers that Monte Carlo predicts, is it real? So he wanted to have a definitive way to do that. He went to Monte Carlo and worked on the roulette wheels to try to find out if there was any opportunity to determine the probability of winning in a roulette wheel. And he did this. He gathered 6 assistants, all of his savings, and went to Monte Carlo to try to figure out if the 6 roulette wheels were going to give him something he could predict. And he worked on this 12 hours a day until finally he found out there was a little scratch in one of the wheels, and he determined that that specific wheel would land on specific numbers more than the others. And so he wrote down the numbers that were happening more often, and very quickly he was able to win $500,000 back in 1873, was just a massive amount of money. The casino owners realized that he was pretty smart, so at night they took the wheels and moved them to different locations. So when he came back, he thought, oh, it's going to be the same day, and he started losing money. It wasn't until 4 days later he found out that they moved the wheel. So he went back and started playing that wheel, and he eventually amassed a fortune of $300,000 and left with a good pocket of change. But he learned something very interesting, that the higher frequencies he observed for certain numbers have arisen by chance. And this is the thing about probability, it really is chance. So the question is, how closely can you expect your observations of a system to conform to probabilities? And this was a struggle all throughout this time period, and that struggle became the invention of calculus. So we owe gambling theory to the invention of mathematics as we know it, but it also has a direct bearing on how we choose our work. And if you think about it on the basis of probability, it actually begins to make a little bit of sense. I won't read this screen. I think you have the PowerPoint. But let's talk about something very interesting. Pascal determined that this triangle can actually help you determine the probability of an event. And it's a little bit of deep theory, but he was right on. He looked at all the probable random numbers and determined which ones were more likely to occur. And it's a very interesting theory. It's worthwhile looking at. I won't go over it now. But let's say we have 12 companies who bid on the same type of work, which is used to be typical, maybe not so much anymore, but normally 4 companies would compete for each bid. And according to Pascal's Triangle, when we look at the row 12, you go back and look at the triangle, there are 495 different distinct arrangements of the group of 4 bidders from 12 companies. And that sounds a little bit mind-boggling in a way, but really it isn't. Thinking about how you're going to optimize your bid is very interesting, because I actually tracked all the work that my company did for 5 years and determined that I could find out when to bid and when not to bid and how much to bid. And it was very successful. The mathematics of it is very straightforward. If you are into math, you probably can see the relevance of it. If not, understand that this theory put into practice has both benefits and drawbacks. My company was called WSCI, and this is one typical bid that we did. And we didn't end up we did a shadow bid. We didn't actually bid the job, and we realized, hey, you know what? These other guys have something going on. We don't know what it is. So we plotted it on a probability curve, and you can see the layout of the bidders. We were down below the curve. Some bidders were outliers, and you can see the winning bid at the very top. And that brought up some interesting questions. Can we predict this? So we started to plot everything on a probability curve. Every contractor that would bid, we would target them to see how they did against us in our shadow bids. And the question came up, it's very difficult when you try to look at a whole group of bidders. There's too much randomness involved. So we started to look at it. How do we do this and stop gambling and start planning? So we needed a way to present the data that would allow identification of the key elements in the bid model. And this is actually very interesting, because it's a process very much like Jaeger did when he was on the roulette wheel. He had an idea of what the probability of the numbers were, but he didn't really understand why it was happening. And our logic started to change when we looked at probability distributions based on a particular bidder. Now, I have to say that it takes time to do this. It's not a one-off thing. You have to be methodical in how you manage the information, the bid results, and tracking one bidder to find out what's happening with that bidder. But it really means if you're bidding against 4 companies at the same time, you have to do that for each one. And a little bit of research on the back end of each of the bidders can help you a lot to understand their financial situation, how much backlog they have. Maybe they have a new chief estimator who's been given the job to be very aggressive and get work, etc. So, it's not a simple thing, but you have to understand that there are reasons why things are happening. And if you can divine the reason why things are happening, you have a much better job, chance of, and I use the word chance specifically, of putting in a bid in at your price and winning. And I say your price because anybody can win a bid if they forget something. Anybody can win a bid if they decide to go with no profit, no equipment charges, no home office charges. I mean, if they drive it down to nothing, they can often win a bid, but they can't make any money. So the purpose is to not only win the bid, but to make money on the job. So the area under a mean probability curve is a very important concept, and we use it all the time in economics to determine where our economy is going. So the same logic can be used in where is our company going? Where is our future going when we're in a competitive market? Again, it comes down to some pretty simple integration, which is calculus, which is really depending on gambling theory. And I make that connection only because of the history. If you look at the cumulative bid distribution here, it starts to tell you some things. And so the great advantage of using complementary distribution is that, let me just minimize that. The probability of any bid being low is at a point of the curve directly above A, and you'll see where A is on the graph. There's no need to calculate an area under the curve, though. We could calculate that point or pick it directly off the curve. And this is really very interesting for the estimator. We decided not to work with individual jobs as we've been doing before. We needed to plot them by competitor. And we needed to select all the jobs each competitor bid on so that we would know. And if you look at back the probability calculation, the cumulative probability, there's an R value. And I have to say it's very easy now, because within Excel, if you plot all your data and you go to a trend analysis and you allow the computer to plot this cumulative curve, it will show you the R value very easily. And I use it all the time in my forecasting of escalation. I use it in forecasting of overall job cost and overall, well, more importantly, job losses. I was on a job in Seattle with Link Light Rail, and we made the unfortunate mistake of not doing any pre-investigation. They gave us the opportunity to do that. We didn't do it. And it was a $127 million job. And by the end of 2 years, we're $300 million upside down. And so I was the cost manager, and eventually I became the claims manager. And I plotted the curve every week as to where our losses were going. And within the first month, I predicted a $300 million loss 2 years from now. And at the end of 2 years, well, it was true. Nobody at my company would accept my plots or my predictions. They would just throw them out. At the end of the day, that's exactly where we ended up. Nobody liked it. Nobody liked me. I was, in fact, they asked me to leave the construction division because I was predicting how much money they were going to lose. So it's powerful, but it's also somewhat unfriendly because you're telling people bad news. The reverse is, in a bidding environment, you can use this same methodology to start to guide the company to go toward the jobs they should invest in and they should bid in, and select the jobs carefully. It really does mean, though, you should do shadow bids. You should do bids on the jobs that you're competing against, the companies you're interested in. You have to see how your people are doing compared to what they're coming up with. So it's a side-by-side thing. And so your estimators, a lot of companies will put estimators on a project code. So the only time they get paid is if they're working on a project. Well, that's a huge mistake, because estimators should be used paid full-time and be busy all the time, bidding work as a shadow bid or an actual bid, and be independent of any project charge code. They have to be covered by overhead. And that's a big mistake engineering companies make every day. There isn't a single estimating company or engineering company that has estimators on overhead, because overhead's a killer, right? Everybody wants to reduce their overhead. Construction companies that understand this, the estimators are treated like gold, because they are providing the lifeblood of the company. So the procedure we developed was outlined as follows. Starting with contractor ABC, we selected an R interval of 2% and counted the number of bids in that interval. The 2% interval was the largest interval we could use and still have accuracy with the probability model. Any smaller, we would not have enough bid to work with. So this is kind of an idea of the counting process with the R value versus the bid count, and that's an important table. This contractor we chose, ABC, bid against us 25 times during the period we counted bids. What we need is a cumulative distribution curve so we could avoid we could avoid measuring the area under the curve. How do we do that? This table takes each of the elements of the cumulative distribution curve and produces a profit ratio. And it tells you where you have to bid the job with profit to win the job. And so it's a very interesting dance that you do. You have to know your company's information. You have to shadow bid. You also have to track very carefully the competitor that you're working against and understand that competitor entirely. So it's a very interesting process. And what you end up doing is you have a range of what you can do against that contractor. And I say a range because it's within that 2% cumulative probability. So we assumed that if we submitted a bid to our competitors, lowest bid, the probability we would win would be 1. And that's logical because our competitor never bid low enough to defeat that bid. Some mathematicians might say that's an incorrect assumption. True, but it worked for us. For a bid with a markup of 0.99, in other words, a loser, the probability to win would also be 1. Just because we had a bid with a high enough probability of winning a loser job does not mean we want it. That interval would be our starting point only. We'd focus on maximizing profit, not decreasing it. And we calculated the column FRR in the column by taking the number of bids the competitor had bid that are at least as big as the next interval. And then we divided that number by the total number. So it's really just mathematics. And that's where the profit column R1 is what we expected, the profit we expect when we win. And as strange as it sounds, we could not afford to win 100% of the time. We'd go broke. I mean, we would. We wouldn't have enough staff. We wouldn't have craft. We wouldn't have equipment. We'd just be running ourselves ragged and make mistakes. So we wanted to know the optimal bid and the one that is a combination of most profit and the highest probability of winning. So we got to the point where we said, we're only going to bid the jobs that are going to provide us with the highest profit. The rest of them we're going to let go. So that's an interesting thing. You won't find management buying into this. Most of the time, the vice presidents are on a bonus system, and the more you bid, the more they make. Whether the job's a loser or not, they get their bonus. So it's a very interesting environment that we are in. I bid 17 times against PCL on water treatment work, and every time, every bid I lost by $10,000. And after the 17th bid, our vice president came to me and said, I am not reviewing your work anymore because every time I add $10,000, you lose. So I'm going to trust that your bid is correct. And I went to win the next 10 in that arena. It was absolutely amazing. But he walked away from adjusting my numbers because he was playing with the market. He was playing with the bid numbers without knowing what he was doing. So this table is what I call an expectation calculation. And in short term, it says what profit versus what bidder is going to give you the best opportunity to get your profit. According to this model, the optimal bid against a competitor is a markup of 7%. The bid was the highest expectation is always the winner. In this case, that was 7%. We only had a 50% probability of winning, however, but that's the most profitable markup combined with a realistic probability of winning. So it's a battle of determining which jobs you're focusing on and how much money you want to make. And you have to make that business decision to say you're not going to go after lousy, crappy jobs. And you won't get disappointed if you're not going to win every time. Failure is the driver that gets you to be a profitable company. As long as you don't lose it in money, if you lose it in statistics, you will be a successful company because you will learn from what you're doing. And that starts right at the top. That starts with having a management that is aware of the value of probability and statistics, and most don't have a clue. They just don't have any idea. So I think that what we have is an opportunity to learn how to find the work that we can bid, find out how much money do we need to make from that work to be profitable, and do the homework of the companies that we're working against, do the homework of shadow bidding, and do the homework of knowing your own company's requirements to actually make a profit. And that's not clear all the time, because companies often make a lot of money off their rental fleet of or their fleet of equipment, and they kind of play with that a little bit. So you have to really go back and really be honest with yourself to predict what profit do you need to make for the company to survive and thrive. So in Seattle, I was fortunate enough to work very closely with our senior vice president. He was with RCI, and when RCI was taken over by Parsons, he continued on, and he hired me in RCI, and I continued to work with him for 5 years. And he told me that the simplest thing to win bids is to be careful, to understand the competitor, be careful to understand how much money you do need to make, and then focus on the one job that is the job for you, and only bid that job, make the money, move on to the next one, do exactly the same thing. And his company was incredibly successful, way more successful than anybody else. He never had a cash flow problem. He never had to steal from the job he's working on to pay the bills of the last one. So I hope that this is a bit of an eye-opener as to how to position yourself to win work, to maintain a very healthy company. And unfortunately, there's a head wall in front of you, and that is, does management understand what needs to be done? And that's a difficult question. Most don't, and those that do, they're very successful. Anyway, that's my presentation.
Hey, thanks a lot, Calvin. I guess we'll open it up to question and answers. And if you have a question, please raise your hand, and I'll call on you in the order that your hand was raised. Okay, looks like I don't see anyone raising their hand. Calvin, I could probably talk to you for days on this, as I have a lot of questions on this. It seems like, I guess I'll start off. It seems like this is a pretty complex math oriented discussion or topic. And my first question would be, um, how do you factor in your knowledge or your research on your competitors into this math model? I mean, how does that factor into what you see on the curves and things like that?
Well, understanding that we all have access to bid tabs. Okay, first thing you do, you collect all the bid tabs for a long period of time, and I don't know if you could say a year, but at least a bidding season, and look at the data. Take the data and plot it on a cumulative distribution curve, which Excel does for you like automatically, and start to look at the trends of what Excel is saying. Now, I can share on my screen what I do with escalation using this method. And I've been tracking escalation since 2008, and my predictions have been correct every year. And the Canadian government uses them, the US government, Defense Department, everybody uses the predictions. If they ask me, they use my numbers. And so it's not really science. It's simply thoroughness, right? It's thoroughness. And I mean, I met with the Canadian government in Vancouver a year ago for a $4 billion job. And they said, we have to go to the Treasury Board to get approval for this project. How do we know that the escalation that you're predicting is correct? So I led them through the process. I did a presentation, and the Treasury Board of Canada approved my method, and they used that as the escalation curve. And the same thing for the province of Quebec, we were doing a buyout of a bridge. We were purchasing it from CN, and they needed to know what the future cost of the project was. And the government of Quebec uses my escalation curve, went to the Treasury Board, they agreed with it, they've seen it before, bang. You have some power when you look at things methodically and you can back it up. So if you want to, I can share my escalation curve. It's very interesting, actually, because it comes down to what can we do with Excel, really? That's the question. And Excel is such a powerful tool. I had an opportunity to work with one of the developers of Excel back in Seattle in 1997. He actually came to work for me on the Mariner Stadium when we built Mariner Stadium. And he taught me a lot of stuff. And we never, ever really understood why people don't understand Excel. They use it like a little coffee cup, put some coffee in it, drink it, and then that's it. They don't really understand the depth and power that Excel has. And I use it for my purposes. Other people use it much better than I do. But ultimately, it is a tool that can really, really help you. So let me see here. Okay, I think I can share this. Okay, coming back down here. Let's see, share. Okay, let me know if you can see my screen.
Yes, I can.
Okay, so ENR publishes a index of cost called CCI, and they've been doing this. They have information from 1908 until today, and they do it by month. And so one of the problems or one of the issues with cost information is always dependent on what larger events have changed the cost model. For example, when the stock market takes a correction, so does everything to do with cost, and these models are so sensitive to that. So I basically have taken data from 1980 until now because that is the most relevant curve information. And you can see that this is the current year, this bar, right? And this is the last data. And you can see this is what my trend line is producing. And this is my R value right here. And as soon as you do a forecast trend model in Excel, it gives you this equation. This equation can be, you can plug in these values in, you can take your data, plug it in these values, and well, for example, my future calculation is here. This is from 2022. So the numbers from the R value are put in here, and it's allowed to run by year. Every year I project a new value, and it tells me that I projected 4% inflation for construction for 2023. Now, what happened was when I put the new data in from end of 22 to 23, this value changed to 7% because of the massive correction from COVID. So it's very, very sensitive to what the current information is, especially when it deviates off this curve. You can see here where the model is below the current value, and you can see it's trying to correct here, right? And as you add more dots above the line, this prediction changes. So because I do this every 6 months, I always try to take the latest data. It gives me an opportunity to project out 10 years. And I take an average and a midpoint, and that's what I publish. And everybody today is so scared about what COVID's doing. Oh man, it's going to kill us. Well, it's a short-term thing, right? Short-term thing. So you go out 5 years, you're at 3.5% inflation, well, escalation for construction. So it's very, very interesting. I just want to say that Excel is your friend, right? Excel is your friend. So if you want to start collecting data, you can take this PowerPoint, you can look at what I've said about creating the tables. You need to start doing some shadow bids, find out where your company is. You need to find out what your profit is to make money. You need to then start to look at it to select which and it's by bidder. When that bidder is bidding a job, you need to figure out, can you make money against him, right? And so it's a lot of work, but it's actually very, very methodical.
How many companies do you think are using some sort of method that resembles this?
None.
In terms of
None. And the reason is it's management. I actually presented it to Parsons that they could use it, and they said, no, we can't, because then we would be considered to be, how did they say it? Manipulating the market. They didn't want to be known as someone who could predict the future.
That's a superpower.
It's strange. It's strange. It's strange.
Yeah.
It's like, if you know what you're doing, you actually have a lot of information at your hands, and you actually can make a difference. And I think that's probably where people like me, they don't really thrive in a large engineering environment. They almost need to go and do it on their own and say, by the way, guys, if you don't want to know what I'm doing, I can do it all by myself.
Right. Okay. Are there any other people in the audience that have a question or comments? Okay. Looks like no questions. Calvin, I'll be sure to reach out to you separately, and I'd love to learn more about this topic if you have some time later on. Okay.
Sure. So I can't take credit for this model. I worked with the PhD at Salt Lake City, in Salt Lake City, one of the universities there, and I collaborated with him to take his wealth of 50 years of probability theory and to develop the model with him. So it's a collaborative event,
Okay.
collaborative effort.
Okay. Thanks so much. I guess with that, thank you everyone for joining us today, and thank you, Calvin, for the great presentation. Just a reminder, you can find us online at aacehawaii.com. If you're on LinkedIn, we'd like to invite you to connect with AACE Hawaii and also our board of directors. A recording of this presentation will be posted on our YouTube channel. You can find a link to our channel on our website at aacehawaii.com. We look forward to seeing you again at future AACE Hawaii events and hope you have a great weekend. Aloha, everyone.